So today, well rather tonight because it's night right now, if you couldn't notice, I will be reorganizing my room. I look sharp right now, but it is what it is. Now we don't look that sharp. It's lighter. I'm in my NYPD shirt because we love Mom Donnie stand. So, guess what? The plan is to put this bookshelf down there. Now we'll see if we can do that. We'll see. Oof, right. First, you have to remove all this stuff.
today is easier than ever. Well, until you look at your phone bill. We've all been there. You cross the border, look at a map, and wham, bam, bippity, bam, your local cellular phone carrier hits you with massive, unexpected roaming charges. But you can avoid all that drama with the sponsor of this video, UBG. UBG is an app that gives you instant eSIM data plans in over 200 destinations around the world. With UBG, there are no surprise roaming fees, saving you around 90% compared to your local carrier. Plus, there's absolutely no commitment. My favorite part, it's the only app you can actually recharge, even if you have zero Wi-Fi or cellular data credit left. It is ideal to prepare in advance for your trip and travel stress-free. Your data plan activates the second you arrive at your destination and turn it on. So go ahead and download the UBG app now. Even if you don't have a trip plan tomorrow, it can seriously come in handy if you find yourself without Wi-Fi on your next adventure. You never know. Use promo code MrBeat to get a 10% discount. The link is in the description for real. Thank you to UBG for sponsoring this video. The United States and its allies poured money into Afghanistan. Billions and 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 billions of dollars for reconstruction, building roads, hospitals, and training a new Afghan army and police force. We help set up a facility for women to come in and get special treatment for them. And I'm checking them in, doing blood pressure and stuff like that. See, I'm an infantry guy, but I'm doing this medical work. Indeed, this was the nation-building phase of the war, and it was pretty dang ambitious. Essentially, the goal was to transform one of the poorest, most underdeveloped countries on the planet into a stable, functioning democracy. Oh, and doing it while simultaneously fighting off a lingering insurgency. No pressure. The United Nations Security Council established the International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF, which eventually took over command of security operations across most of Afghanistan. At its peak, the ISAF would have 400 military bases throughout the country and troops from 42 different countries. Some real progress was made in these early years. Life expectancy went up. Infant mortality declined. Girls who had been banned from education under the Taliban could now go to school. Afghans created a new constitution and began to hold elections. Al-Qaeda was a shadow of itself, but there were some serious problems. Okay? First of all, the Taliban didn't just disappear. They grouped in the mountainous tribal areas of Afghanistan and nearby Pakistan, where the Pakistani government had limited ability and will to go after them. Heck, even Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, was historically a bit too cozy with the Taliban. Indeed, the Taliban used Pakistani territory as a safe haven to recruit, train, and launch attacks back into Afghanistan. Second, corruption. The Afghan government, from top to bottom, was riddled with corruption. For real. Money meant for reconstruction just disappeared. Like a sign of how this was doomed to failure was just the sheer open corruption of everything. The governor of Kunar province was openly enriching himself. Warlords who had become allies with the United States sold illegal stuff. In fact, Afghanistan became the world's leading producer of opium. Third, and this is a big one, the Bush administration decided to get the United States involved in another war. After the United States invaded Iraq to topple the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein, on March 20th, 2003, the administration shifted its focus and resources into what became known as the Iraq War. I admit about it. But yeah, after this, the United States shifted attention and resources away from Afghanistan. And the Taliban noticed this. By 2005, Taliban attacks had begun to dramatically increase. Roadside bombs, usually improvised explosive devices or IEDs, became the signature weapon of the insurgency. Suicide bombings increased. Taliban fighters, who had quietly blended back into villages, began organizing and fighting again. In Helmand province, in the south of Afghanistan, things got particularly crazy. British forces deployed there in 2006 were stunned by the intensity of the fighting. Many of them had to fall into defense positions in some of the most intense combat of the war. In response to this, NATO launched major operations to clear Taliban strongholds across southern Afghanistan. In Operation Medusa, Canadian troops, believe it or not, led a brutal push to clear Taliban fighters out of the Kandahar province. But once NATO troops left an area, Taliban fighters would come right back. As it turns out, this would be a reoccurring theme in the war in Afghanistan. Coalition forces would clear an area of Taliban fighters, but without enough troops to hold the area permanently, the Taliban would just come back once the coalition forces moved on. Take classic counterinsurgency dilemma. By 2007, Taliban forces had at least 10,000 soldiers fighting. Over the next 2 years, that number would double. In 2008, President Bush began authorizing raids into Pakistan, even though Pakistan didn't like that so much. Bush also began withdrawing troops from Iraq while consistently increasing more troops to Afghanistan. That same year, Barack Obama won the presidential election in part by promising to end the Iraq War. And indeed, after he got into office, he swiftly began to withdraw American forces from Iraq. But the new president remained committed to finding Osama bin Laden. Wait, they still ain't found bin Laden in nearly 8 years? Nope, they still ain't found him. Not only that, by that time, the Taliban was as strong as ever. In 2009, Stanley McChrystal took over command of NATO operations in Afghanistan, launching Operation Strike of the Sword. In Helmand province, the biggest offensive airlift by the Marines since the Vietnam War. It didn't go as well as McChrystal had hoped. He begged Defensive Secretary Robert Gates for more troops, up to 40,000 more if possible, otherwise the war might be lost. After McChrystal's pleas for more troops became public, even more Americans began to wonder what the heck the United States was still doing in Afghanistan. When I got word that, you're deploying, you don't have a choice. I remember thinking, well, at least it's the good word. I didn't want to have anything to do with Iraq. I was very much of the thought that this is still a war of retribution for 9/11. And, in many ways it still was. Osama bin Laden had yet to be caught.
The perception just drastically shifted. When we deployed, my perception was we're going over there to fight against this terrorist organization. And, I like to take the phrase from Always Sunny in Philadelphia, rock, flag, and eagle. Once you're over there and you see what's going on, and you see these people just trying to survive, and they're in this middle ground of we've taken over their country, and they have to work with us, but they know we're going to leave, and they know the Taliban's going to be right there, and this is a regime-building exercise, and it's not a good one.
Obama remained committed to the cause. He ordered a surge of 30,000 more troops to the country.
I have determined that it is in our vital national interest to send an additional 30,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan.
Yeah, I just said that. That would now bring the total American force in the country to around 100,000. Obama's goal was still to defeat Al-Qaeda.
Our overarching goal remains the same: to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan.
I just said that. Now, announcing a withdrawal date while simultaneously escalating was controversial, to say the least. Supporters argued it would motivate the Afghan government to step up. Critics, including some of Obama's own generals, argued it told the Taliban that all they had to do was wait.
Sure as we're like the local leader meetings, and it'd be the leaders of the village. We would sit down, we'd have chai tea with them, we'd eat, and we'd talk about what's going on. And that's what was crazy was you would know that there would be people at that shura who were just shooting at you last night.
The surge years, 2010 and 2011, were actually the deadliest years in the war for American troops. More than 700 Americans died during those 2 years. The Korengal Valley, near the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan, became known as the, quote, Valley of Death, since that's where some of the most intense combats of the entire war went down. In May 2011, everything changed. CIA intelligence had tracked Osama bin Laden to a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, not hiding in some cave in the mountains, but living in a relatively comfortable house in a mid-sized city in Pakistan, not far from Pakistan's main military academy. President Obama authorized a raid by Navy SEAL Team 6 in the early morning hours of May 2nd, 2011, in Operation Neptune Spear. The SEALs broke into the compound and shot and killed Osama bin Laden. There's a now iconic picture of Obama and his advisors watching it take place. 12 years later, a YouTuber went to the exact site where this all went down and found a cow grazing and kids playing cricket. Oh, and a lot of trash. American forces would later bury his body at sea. After Obama announced the news, crowds immediately gathered outside the White House, chanting, Indeed, most Americans were thrilled. The man who had ordered the 9/11 attacks was dead. The primary justification for the entire war had been accomplished, but the war didn't end.
But
because
we got it done. We got it
it wasn't
done.
really about bin Laden anymore.
I'm just so tired. But it is what it is.
As Obama had promised, American troop levels in Afghanistan had decreased in 2012. NATO combat operations officially ended at the end of 2014, replaced by a smaller resolution support mission focused on training and advising Afghan forces rather than leading combat operations. But the war wasn't over, not even close. Francis, Taliban attacks continued. Afghan security forces, now technically leading the fight, took catastrophic casualties. Thousands of soldiers and police killed every single year. The Taliban made steady territorial gains. Districts that had been cleared multiple times fell again. The United States was afraid that if they left, the Afghan government would immediately collapse. A new group also entered the picture, ISIS-K, the Afghan affiliate of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Remember ISIS? That group that gained a lot of power in Syria and Iraq in 2013 and 2014? Well, they spread to Afghanistan too. ISIS-K, in some ways, was even more extreme than the Taliban, and the two groups actually fought each other at times. So now you've got a three-way war going on at points. Great.
One of the biggest eye-opening moments for me was when they had an election and my truck got called
It's still on. Oh shoot. Whew, okay, gotta lock in again. All right, let's do this. Let's put on another video essay. Let's see.
Cheap hotel rates, cheap travel deals, cheap flights, and more. This note originally begins in 2003 and ends in the beginning of 2010, before the big boom of the internet, as well as being on a entirely different social and technological landscape compared to the modern era. Now, what would happen if Kira didn't get the death note in 2003, but instead he got it in our real world today? How would the advent of technology and historical events change his movement throughout the story? And most importantly so, will Kira be able to survive and perhaps even thrive in this era, even more than how he thrived during his original reign as a god of the New World? First, I'll clarify that we will assume in the time skip that no shenanigans with the death and birth. There's no sea cat that will appear, nor will Minoru Tanaka get the death note. If you didn't know, these two were separate killer cases that happened after the original one, where they were given a death note. While we are on the topic of different killer cases, we should also talk about the Akira case in slight detail, since it has some relevance to this topic as we got a direct reference on whether Light could carry out his work as Kira. The one shot takes place in 2017, which isn't really close to us anymore, but still relatively far more advanced than the original timeline. Minoru was given a death note and asked to carry forth the footsteps of Light Yagami, but Minoru rejected doing it, because he thought that it would be far too difficult with the advanced detections of crime, and general difficulty of committing a crime being far higher, but ended the conversation by saying he does believe that the original killer would have been able to find a way nonetheless, even with these problems persisting in his way. Now, while the statement is fairly outdated since it was made around 2017, I do think it still applies, as will be covered later on in the video. We will assume Light obtains a death note in the exact same way. He picks up a notebook he sees that drop from the sky, takes it home, and then leaves it before using it to kill a singular person, before starting his spree of kills. I'll be dividing this video into scenarios specifically. I will address the biggest elephant in the room about this topic, which is obviously whether or not L is still there to oppose Kira, as his presence changes things drastically. The first half of this video will be about in case if L himself is not present, which will allow us to focus more on what Light will do as Kira today rather than their mind battles. While the second half will explore how exactly these mind games will change given the new era, such as the agencies and L himself. How different is this Light Yagami? Some of you may think this is an odd question to ask, but I do think it makes sense. Light would most likely be far more at odds with the system, and his levels of resentment would likely be far higher than it was in the original timeline. It should go without saying, but the world has changed as a whole vastly from the era Light was born in. It has gotten far more cruel with the after effects of capitalism causing the wider disparity of wealth, and the people who we deem as evil having full abilities of evading any responsibility, which Light would not appreciate a lot. Japan's decline as a country is also something Light would most likely connect to the people surrounding him, and most likely extend this perspective to the entire world, but the world being far too corrupt to continue as it is, bolstering the same incentive to change the world by purging them of these impurities. His desire or urge to be the god of this new world would be far more powerful than the original motivation he had to do so, as the terrible things that are currently going on without any sort of consequences attached to them as such. When he does get his hands on the death note, he'll be far less hesitant and most likely already have a few people in mind when he gets it originally. The desire to become the god of the new world would also likely remain, as in spite of the difficulty he might have. Light would not care and still desire his identity to be publicly known, so that everyone knows him as a person who is carrying out this duty akin to that of a god. Moving on, the internet. The development of the internet from its infantile stages to what it is currently is something that goes without saying, as it has become the greatest collection of information that is available to humanity, and would undoubtedly be Light's biggest advantage, as well as disadvantage that we'll discuss later. Light's intelligence would most likely mean that he would either be extremely aware and knowledgeable about computers, which is something we've seen in a live adaptation that took merely 2 years after the original timeline-wise, where he's able to hack into government agencies all on his own. Although it is a very useful thing, it is also something his biggest adversary in this situation would use, as we will talk about later again. Light will be well aware that the internet is not anonymous like it was back then in the 2000s, and would most likely try to keep every action he does with respect to the idea that it is possible that someone else might know who and what he's trying to do at any moment in time. Now, covering what some of you surely clicked this video for, the Epstein list. While the controversy surrounding the Epstein files isn't as big in Japan as it is in the USA, there'd be little chances that someone like Mike wouldn't have heard of it. And given his charade with justice, would most likely be far more justice hungry to correct the current world order that is controlled by the corrupted rich in his image. The Epstein list, in a way, is a very perfect encapsulation of what Light hates about our current world. He hates the criminals who are able to get away with it because of their abilities and influence throughout this. In the very chapter of Death Note itself, we see Light saying that he already killed the most dangerous, infamous criminals in the world, with many of them obviously never being arrested or experiencing a night inside a jail. We see Light talk about the system itself being wrong, citing it when saying his father was a fool who was trapped by the anonymous system, and in his eyes, these people are allowing the system to exist and even thrive more. Even if we ignored any other factors, Light's personal morality would most likely concur as enough reason to go out of his way to kill everyone he deems responsible, most likely in ways that will send out a message to the rest of the people who are connected deeply to the system that has made this world rotten, whether that is done through creating messages written out of their own blood, making them die horrible, terrifying, painful deaths that will make everyone consider what they are doing. In the eyes of everyone else, if even the most powerful people on Earth, no matter their influence, are not safe from his hand, then that would serve as a great incentive for people who operate in that manner to change their ways, as a way of preventing themselves from becoming one of the people he kills. The Epstein list would also be a very, very important way for Light to gather Western support about his actions and what he intends to do in the future, since he will most likely be extremely aware of the sentiment that the majority of the public holds towards the Epstein files, and views it as a great opportunity he could not let go at all, even if he disregarded the personal resentment he would form. This would likely create a large amount of influx towards his support in the entire world, not only being limited to just the Epstein files, and would likely have him be considered more capable than the government themselves in solving the case, garnering the trust of the people to enact justice in the proper way. Light would most likely develop a way to automate a process through which he could review the information that is present in the files, including the images and the videos, and then decide whether that person deserves to die, or they were just an unrelated bystander, which I would suspect in Kira's eyes might as well be zero, for basically everyone who had affiliation with Jeffrey Epstein directly. This action would most likely serve as the biggest publicity boost he could see in his eyes of the Western world, where appropriate consequences were not given. It is actually very possible that the infatuation of Kira might even be greater than before, because of the general public unrest, as well as the satisfactory with the state of the world being lower than ever before, to a point that, at least for some time, it is possible that the people of the world might actually try to accept Kira and his actions, seeing him at least as better than the world leaders that currently control the world, and viewing him as someone who could possibly really change the current world order. Realistically speaking, it is pretty possible that the very first use of the Death Note will be on someone connected to the Epstein list, who is still alive and whose death could be easily verified by the public. Similar to the very first Kira case, this would allow Light to confirm whether the Death Note was real or fake. The emotion, or rather desire to have to fix our current world, is something that has become increasingly rotten as the world has advanced, being the reason why we even joke about things like us needing a light to purge the world, or large social media posts that are made to spread awareness about the aspects of our world that are wrong, including criminals who commit heinous crimes going without consequence. The only power stopping us from serving justice obviously being the fact that we lack power to do that, and the ones in power are simply not interested in doing something like this. Thanks to his cleansing of the Epstein files, as well as the many more high-profile criminals he had killed at this point, most likely also targeting many figures like Diddy, who have a large public outrage surrounding them, and many more throughout, the Kira cult would likely be far bigger than you'd expect, and most likely become the biggest cult in the world, as it will be the most tangible god that they could worship. As the internet has a lot more users now, there would most likely be far more support online in almost every form, promoting the idea that what Kira is doing is correct and just in the eyes of some.
Who could have it in the woods? That's approved by the locals. Booking.com. Booking.yeah.
log into your old Clash account. Number one, while you've been away, your base auto-upgraded itself for however long you were inactive for, meaning your base could be ready to move on up to the next town hall. Number two, troop training times have been completely removed, so you can clash forever and fill those resources quicker. Number three, upgrade times at the lower town halls have been drastically reduced to accompany returning players getting the upgrades done faster. Number four, the game is very free-to-play friendly with free events, chests, and tons of magic items. Number five, you can finally remove obstacles without your builders.
Of some, the world is in a worse shape than in the past, so I think that there will be far more people that will be open to the idea of a person like Kira working behind the scenes, as long as it did not negatively influence their own lives. Of course, there would most likely be many more people who would outline how Kira is incorrect, and his moral justice code could be considered childish, but the support for Kira, publicly speaking, would probably be far greater than before. Kira's unwillingness to clean up the world's leaders in general would likely also be a source of disappointment from the public, as Lai himself knows that killing world leaders en masse is a terrible idea from the start, as it would only bring the wrong kind of attention and incentive to Kira as a figure in this world, meaning that it will be extremely difficult. There will be many big attempts to censor support on the internet regarding Kira that will likely would go as well as you think. Kira would most likely learn soon about the fact that the internet was going so far as to censor his name, meaning that he would likely go out of his way to threaten very important people if it was necessary, but he would do so that there will be freedom regarding the support the internet can provide to its name, considering that Light does love whenever people acknowledge his existence as Kira. And if I'm being honest, he'd be someone who would most likely save a few edits of Kira, like the Dark Triad or any other Death Note edit that is still viral to this day. Lai would also be heavily against the brain-rotted internet of today, considering one of his plans in the original manga was to eventually eliminate lazy people, as he believed that they were also hindering society. In his eyes, brain rot would most likely be seen as something corrupting human intelligence, and therefore as another hindrance to society. Content like that would most likely no longer be allowed on platforms at all, unless it was thought to have some kind of intellectual value. So at least Light is giving us some justice, and even might bring back the golden age of YouTube. Overall, I don't think we can consider it as nothing more than a very, very small possibility that Light would get caught if L was never involved in this case, since Light would have zero competition, and absolutely no one would ever consider it a phenomenon related to magic. No matter how you wanted to put it, the source of the murder method would have to be something that could be deduced through science, which is not something that Death Note operates on. It's more likely that they would even consider it an attack from aliens before they thought that something like a Death Note existed. I do think that eventually they will be forced to consider the unreasonable, but even then, it's not like they would have anything to latch onto as information. It's much more likely that they might just view it as the Illuminati doing it, which would fuel the conspiracy theorists, but not much more on that. The biggest problem in general is that without someone like L creating something similar in veins of the L Taylor tactic, there'd be a question of how do they even begin approaching such a case? Since without any information on Kira at all, and there being billions of people who could possibly be committing the crime, it would be impossible to do anything unless Light makes a more novice mistake somewhere down the line that could make the case more tense. While sure, Light without L pursuing him might not turn out to be as smart and meticulous as it did with time, but I doubt that Light could miss out that hard. Any agency trying to locate Kira has a problem of having basically zero premises to function upon. Usually, in any criminal case, there's at least some information on the circumstances, but in Light's case, they would only have the fact that heart attacks are happening to criminals, and they are being induced by an unknown number of people, with there being no disclosure of what type of technology, or rather, what kind of method it is based upon. The case would most likely not get further than them finding out time zones regarding the person's killing hours. But even then, you'll be obstructed since there's a lot of time zones overlapping throughout the world. And even if they happen to find that it was Japan, there would still be no way to catch Lai unless he's stupid enough to disregard the fact that his presence on the internet is being tracked as well as the existence of cameras in this world. The case would eventually go without anything they could do besides accepting Kira, since ironically, the best chance at the case being solved will be smart strangers on the internet trying their best to do so.
Now, let us discuss what would happen if L was also a part of this scenario, which makes this far more interesting than the alternative scenario. L's backstory will relatively remain the same, as I don't think there will be much change on his end. Besides that, he would have to be very experienced with cybercrime, as his status covering himself as the greatest detective in the world would require him to be familiar with the many forms of cybercrime that go on in this world. We've seen how L's interest in computers was something he had extremely early on in his lifetime, when they were nowhere near as powerful as they currently are in the modern world back when he was a child. So by inference, we know that L would be extremely good at using them to his advantage, to the point that it would not be surprising that Light would have to avoid the usage of the internet as a whole when he becomes a suspect, as everything he does on the internet will be traceable and thus under danger. The case would likely begin in the truest sense relatively the same, but it will be far more difficult for Light in this case, since the people helping L will be far more competent than the ones we saw in the show, meaning that it will be made difficult for Light to combat against all of them. L's Lynn L. Taylor tactic would most likely be slightly altered with time, using as the advertiser beforehand to the internet via various methods such as using short-form media, putting up billboards, or just running ads on general websites before the advertisement actually ran, most likely on extremely short notice to make sure Light does not look too deeply, but enough so that the information catches fire and spreads. Not only this, but things like security cameras covering basically the entire planet in footage that can be replayed later for security reasons makes it highly unlikely that he can do anything suspicious in public that won't come back and bite him, like he does multiple times with Ray and Naomi in the earlier parts of Death Note. The event would, of course,
8 best eSIM deals for Asia that you can't miss. Be a happy tourist in Thailand with this deal. Stay connected on your favorite apps when in China. Enjoy sightseeing in Japan without ever needing to search for Wi-Fi. If you're in Indonesia for a month, this is a good one. No data drama in the land of K-drama with this plan. Visit these 3 countries on just one eSIM. Visit up to 10 countries on this plan. Visit more than 100 countries in and out of Asia on just one eSIM.
not transpire in the same way, but it would still be more difficult on his end to be able to find ways to deal with Naomi, who he likely wouldn't be able to get rid of in the relatively easy way he's found in canon. I also think that Misa will be an even bigger problem for Light, rather than any help, as people already argue with her presence. She'll be the creator of many, and I mean many problems that you could predict even now, because of the nature of her personality. Misa seems to be the type of person who would be hyperactive on social media, and likely nowhere near as careful when it comes to covering up her traces of activity on the internet, as she might not be aware of the decreasing in the goal to be truly anonymous in this day and age of the internet. I wouldn't even place it out of her character to have pictures of the death note on her phone at one point, as a way to prove that she has a death note in a way. That said, posting it on any form of social media seems a bit too stupid even for her standards. Light would most likely have to go out of his way to create special instructions for Misa to not compromise him at any point, and even that might become far too difficult, since obviously he cannot dictate every single decision Misa makes at all times. Misa's social media presence might also be a problem, as there's chances you could find some traces of her opinion on Twitter being publicly available in some form that could cause suspicion when the case ultimately gets more tightly packed with the suspects and people involved. Misa Amane would most likely be a bigger liability than an asset in this version of the timeline, and it will most likely be a big headache he would have to manage, alongside the fact that L would most likely end up with far more resources than he ended up with, sourced by the people in power, who make for a far more stressful case to Light in the end, and he would have to change things drastically and think of far more creative ideas to get anywhere near as far as it did in the original case. Misa was the reason why, in the original case, Lai had been forced to use memory loss plan altogether, because Misa was suspected as the second killer, which threw all his plans of killing Elle with her down the drain, which was what he was relying upon at the time, meaning that he could not possibly let her go down, hence having to create a plan as risky as a memory loss plan, since he had no other option at that point. Like I mentioned earlier, things like Lai's move during the raid incident would also be impossible, as there'll be far more cameras that would basically make it impossible to conceal his identity as killer. At least the way he executed his original strategy, doing absolutely anything in public as killer would actually be detrimental, which would mean he would very much need to limit his actions to inside his house, because he'd become a suspect irrespective of what he does after being El Taylor. While I do think being killer is possible, I do think at the end of the day, El would most likely win, given he would have support from a far more capable team who wouldn't weigh him down like it did in the original anime. Compounding with the limited things that Lai can do because of the modern world being far more regulated and monitored, all of it would most likely result in El checkmating Lai. It's also reasonable to assume that there'll be a large group of people that will gather on sites with less moderation and more freedom of speech than regular social platforms, like 4chan, which on paper might seem harmless, but considering the cumulative cases that they have unironically been told by 4chan is surprisingly significant, it's not something to take as a joke. While their success itself would be unlikely, you'll still make it more airtight on the patterns of killings Kira tries to make, as it's extremely likely the internet would follow in pursuit if Lai tried to create any pattern, as well as any declaration of his power he'll make being scrutinized to hell and beyond. Akira in the modern day would have to deal with a far more competent L, as well as far more helpful agencies that will be assisting L throughout all of this. Combined with the limitations of the modern era, will likely surmount the advantages Lai gets, and it'd most likely be called prematurely against L, and would lose their battle. Even if Lai does manage to somehow win the battle against L, then he'd most likely lose to the combined mind of Ni and Bello, where his arrogance and overconfidence in his abilities after killing L, similar to Canon, will be the result of his downfall. If any of you have any opinions regarding how this scenario will progress, feel free to comment why and how you think Lai would approach his role as Kira in the modern day, as another perspective is always appreciated.
Look what I found. A 3-in-1 blush and highlighter. Just look at the swatches. So cute and travel friendly.
Narisip ko na ang paboritong food ko at may discount pa. Kita niyo ba kung gaano ako ka-excited? Siyempre! I-download na ang Food Panda today!
Usually, whenever anime is adapted into live action, it ends up being a big failure that neither the original fans nor new fans end up liking. The producers rarely realize that it is extremely hard to translate such vastly different mediums of entertainment without using creativity to make it work. And as such, most of the time, it ends up being a dumpster fire that nobody likes. We have seen this happen time and time again with Dragon Ball Evolution, AOT, Cowboy Bebop, and even Death Note itself having a horrible American live adaptation that did not manage to get much love from the fans. However, very surprisingly, would you believe me that despite this pattern, there's actually a live adaptation that we could consider a decent take on the manga, and at the same time ended up creating a character that was even smarter than the original one. That character being El Lowlight, the greatest detective in the world. It sounds hard to believe when you first hear it, but I promise you that it's not a lie. Death Note is surrounded to the brim with mind games inside mind games, which you would assume makes it hard to be able to create a character smarter than the original, since they have a lot less time to show their abilities. I'm not referring to the American version of L, since it's a topic for another day, but rather the version of L from the Japanese movie adaptation of Death Note that began back in 2005, that ended up having an entire trilogy of movies dedicated to it, creating an alternative timeline of how the Battle of Woods between L and Lai happened. There's also a novelization, but we won't delve into details of that, since L in a novelization is genuinely smarter than both Lai and himself in the original manga put together. However, if enough of you are interested, I'll also cover him later on the channel. And if you like this content, make sure to sub up and join the Discord server, as I'm active on there more often. We will call this version of L CTWL to make it easier when I compare him to Canon L and to ensure you don't misunderstand which version of L I'm currently talking about. Before we compare the two in how they approach the details regarding the Kira case, I'll first get into the major changes in detail regarding their respective backgrounds from prior to the Kira case happening, since I think they give us a good difference in scale from the beginning. When L had turned 8, there were political complications caused by the Winchester mad bombs that had risen to the point that the world had little time before the Third World War was to erupt. While that same 8-year-old L was able to solve the case behind the Winchester mad bombings that led to this conflict, tying it down and thus becoming the one who prevented World War III, being the first person to solve this case despite the most experienced agencies in the world likely trying to solve it before him. Meaning that even before he had reached double digits of age, his intelligence was already far higher than the level of just the usual prodigy of his age. Mummy House is also fairly more advanced in this alternative timeline, as it was considered to be a world-class institution to utilize the financing to turn even the most ordinary-looking orphans into geniuses within their respective fields that the child wished to work in, giving them an education that would not be lost to anyone else, irrespective of where they studied. Despite the many students who could become a part of the institution, Elle was still seen as a godlike race, incomparable to everyone else, as the level at which he was standing was considered downright impossible to be able to reach, as if his existence was like a dream that could never be surpassed, and the status of the British detective belonged to him until the day he died, seemed like the natural way it was supposed to be. In this timeline, even the letter L that CTW decided to choose to represent himself was with appropriate reason, as L referred to him as the last one, someone who stood all alone without any successor to come up after him, alongside it meaning the lost one, referring to his status as if he was a child that was dropped by some omnipotent god onto this world to project his view on justice upon the world. Guy picks up the death note he saw falling from the sky and takes it home. He uses the death note to test it on a singular unsuspecting criminal he was watching on TV at the same time, and continues his killing spree without any restrictions until L involves himself into the case. This version of Lie also has a girlfriend by the name of Shiori, who is different from Misa and is someone he genuinely loves rather than only pretending to do so. L personally reaches out to the ICPO to show them the progress he's made on the Kira case all along, while they have been struggling to accomplish any obstacles watching on TV at the same time, and continues his killing spree without any restrictions until L involves himself into the case. This version of Lie also has a girlfriend by the name of Shiori, who is different from Misa and is someone he genuinely loves rather than only pretending to do so. L personally reaches out to the ICPO to show them the progress he's made on the Kira case all along, while they have been struggling to accomplish anything of merit. His insight on Kira far surpassing their own despite him being a singular person. He's able to confidently claim that even before the case truly began, not only is Kira a person who is operating alone, but he's also a genius with a childish understanding of justice. Let's now try to understand how exactly L deduced that much. L shows us a distribution chart that is constructed from the data he collected from the Kira case killing, with him using the data based on the merger virus visualized into 3D, with multiple distinctions such as age, gender, as well as nationality of every citizen that was infected. Any naturally occurring cause of virus would have perceived in the data, but the data is constructed by a separate distribution chart L has curated, where the deaths have unexplained causes, with there being curves that are fundamentally impossible with various irregularities, leading to the belief that what they're up against is not something as simple as just a virus. This is due to the differences in between the data of the naturally occurring death compared to the strange phenomena they're currently dealing with. Most importantly, that the cause of death was something being chosen by a person rather than chance. Knowing these aren't just coincidences, let's now go back to the original premise L had, where he stated Kira is a singular genius. He presented yet another distribution chart to prove that group crimes statistically are proven to have higher chance of failure when carried out by a large number of people, as it is easy for some of them to mess up, and the assumption that the Kira case murder themselves are run by a group rather than a singular person would require you to believe there are nearly 80 people that are operating this as a group crime, fundamentally making it possible that at least a few of them are unable to leave any evidence behind the crime they committed. Not to mention it's outright impossible that there's zero information surrounding them, therefore proving that such a crime on this scale is currently not logically and statistically feasible to be done by a group, being made far more difficult to assume to be the case, thus concluding that the Kira case is most likely the work of a singular individual through a method that can kill people without any direct contact. L has now found out that Kira was most likely in the Kanto region of Japan. Even the first case that could be linked was one that occurred in that same region, with there soon after being a rise in heart attack-related cases when it came to the death of criminals. Deducing it as such, that the criminal was most likely a testing dummy for Kira's murder method before we began to use it effectively. By analyzing the psychology behind the way Kira had been killing the criminals, he quickly constructed a psychological profile on how Kira worked like. Understanding him as a person who had vast amounts of intelligence with an arrogant sense of self-righteousness regarding the enforcement of what he believed was correct. To be followed through this unknown weapon of mass murder, meaning that the most powerful weapon El could currently use to burn him out was to attack his arrogant self that was conducting himself as if he was the god of this world. El specifically picked a person that was disguised as a person that belonged to the USA, with his status as a detective, and the current broadcast that was on screen was fabricated as a worldwide one, to make Kira think that this is an international broadcast rather than a region-specific one, and learns that apparently the ICBO has decided to have Lindell Taylor be the one to lead the Kira case to find the culprit. El uses Lindell Taylor to mock life as a man filled with extraordinary ego, a man-child who was given far too much power for his own good, and absolutely no different than any other criminal you could find elsewhere, naming him a criminal who kills other criminals to maintain his status as being different or superior, when he is neither, and in the end is no different than the one he killed. El specifically tricks Light's childlike behavior by giving him things he could disprove at the very instant, by just simply killing Lindell Taylor, therefore proving the power of Kira on international television, when all it does is unarguably prove that Kira is indeed in the Kanto region of Japan. Through this, El is also able to verify that Kira cannot kill without faces or names, proving that his earlier analysis on Kira was completely correct in its entirety, and is also able to garner the full trust of the NPA that the case could be solved. El later orders the NPA to provide him with a report regarding all of the times of death for criminals whose cause of death was related to heart attacks, with this originally being an incomprehensible data sheet of random timings. In just a few seconds, El begins to process all of the information in such a way that he was able to construct the precise schedule Kira's killing schedule must be operating by, which aligns perfectly with that of a university or college student and identifies Kira as either of those. This version of Kira also relied on using the NPA database to access private information about certain criminals, which was not yet public knowledge, which was yet another thing that this version of El caught on too quickly, with the only way Kira having access to the NPA database being either a member of the NPA himself, or if he had a rat that gave him information that was working in the NPA, with the final option being that Kira had hacked into the database. The chance to pull Gabriel is only 0.14%, needle in a haystack level. Luckily, during the collab, logging in gives critical rate tickets, boosting summon rates by 20 to 100%. Wow, that's insanely now. And some big news. Log in for 2026 free summons. Wow, Gabriel looks amazing. She's definitely my destined waifu. And another SSR? Chestia? I'm so lucky. El sends 12 agents all over Japan to investigate the Kira case under further scrutiny, but also specifically sends over Rei Imamatsu to follow, as well as investigate Light Yagami, as even at this point, he had become El's first suspect because he fit the psychological profile he had envisioned in his mind at this point already. Light tries to check the investigation by having a person die every hour, which would completely collapse their theory that Light was a student or a university student, but all it did was show El something completely else. He was able to deduce that it was most likely possible that Kira was using his ability to show that he can control the very time a person dies, and he's telling the NPA that Kira has a rat among one of them, which was trying to make them believe their initial hypothesis was wrong. After Rei Imamatsu is found to be dead, El leads the investigation of his death and is also able to notice that at the same scene, Naomi Isara was found to be grieving her fiancé, which happened to be Rei. El also figures out from the position of Rei's death that something caught his attention enough to require him to face the subway during his death, as if he was trying to leave the train, then he would be facing away from the subway, but he wasn't. Therefore, L concluded that it was most likely that Kira was at the scene of crime, and Kira most likely had no preparation or intention to include Naomi Sura, and the fact that he also didn't kill her right then, as he wouldn't have a name to kill her with. Right after this, L also deduces that Kira must be careful of controlling the actions of his victims right before death, including the precise timing at which they died, manipulating Rain into working as his way to get the names of the rest of the 11 FBI agents through his direct command right before he died. This was supported by how earlier in the movie, Kira had used his power to kill 3 criminals dead in jail the night before, who died in bizarre ways that were different from the usual heart attack method, likely being Kira testing the limits of his power. To first understand this part of the movie, I'll need to explain a bit more of what this version of life was actually doing. We need to first establish that this version of life did genuinely love his girlfriend with all his heart. They had begun dating even before Lai had become Kira, so it wasn't a bond he had forged recently. Lai basically created a strategy that centered around guilt-tripping the task force, manipulating in accordance with future goals, where he used the death note to make Naomi kill his girlfriend, Shiori, when they were together. Afterwards, when Naomi kills herself, to remove any suspicion from him regarding the case, since there was no way anyone could have suspected Lai as Kira when his own beloved was killed at the hands of someone who was seeking revenge. There was able to see through all of this without any difficulty, realizing that Lai had done all of this under the concealed motive of constructing a situation where he would have an ironclad reason to join the Kira task force. With his status as a son of someone involved in the investigation, combined with his well-known intellect, meaning L would have little reason to reject Lai in this scenario. L allows Lai to join the task force despite knowing this, because he knows now that they're closer in proximity physically, L could better control the situation, as Lai's attempt at fooling L had completely failed, meaning the situation from the inside was no different besides their proximity now. When Lai joins the task force, L comes up to him to congratulate him for joining, and he will now be working with them, with a very obvious detail in our face. L is eating the exact same flavor of chips as when Lai first used the potato chip tactic in order to throw off suspicion of him as impossible, because the killing still happened despite him being under observation, being confident enough to taunt Lai about the fact he knew that the potato chip tactic was completely in advance. Since I hadn't covered it later, let's talk about the potato chip scene. L had continued to watch the cameras despite there being no major development, with Kira's killing completely stopping for a while, with the 7th day having a single difference. Lai had brought in a potato chip bag. Although it would be something you find normal, CDWL was immediately suspicious of this, unlike Cat and L, who let it go. Similar to the original Light, he writes the names of the criminals he's watching via the small TV in his potato chip bag, and writing the names in the same bag. But, unlike the Canon version, which did not notice what he'd done at this very moment, CDW did. He was able to notice that there were irregular gaps in time where he put his hand inside the potato chip bag, took it out, and then ate it, making it seem like he needed to do something in the notebook that was more complicated than just taking out a chip from it. He was able to deduce that I was likely using an easily portable TV in a small potato chip bag to be able to look at the criminal cases that were being reported at the same time. And with this access to the camera, you could fully deceive the FBA into thinking that Lai could not possibly be Kira, since they saw him studying at a time when he could not possibly be carrying out the murders. They removed the cameras, and of course, doesn't relay this information to anyone else besides himself, giving this an observation that he will later use against Kira. There have been differences in the story until now, but this is where the bigger changes start happening between the two alternative timelines, as you may still be believing that just need to look at the target to be able to kill whoever they want. Combined with him deducing that Lion and the second killer aren't putting together. But in case Lion is not killer, then it would be possible for there to be a big scheme for intention to check the NBA pulled off by the two killers. There was also able to see through the fact that the second killer must have some ties to the media or to a person who can control the media if they operated under the assumption that the abilities of both the killers were similar in nature. Besides the difference of requiring a name or not, with him judging the second killer was also clearly less smart than the original one, with the fact that Sakura TV also had a vantage point from where you could clearly see, making Elle infer that she was likely inside the company's building when the murders happened. Since they did not seem smart enough to be able to hack the system for the information they would need. When the second killer was trying to communicate with Killer Prime, they used words that hint towards there being some importance of an eye, as well as some sort of shinigami. CDWL receives information that the second killer's tapes were in the form of envelopes, which were obviously from Osaka, meaning that the tape located live in Osaka, and also inferring that the second killer is likely to be female, given the small print of the envelope. Elle was able to grasp the meaning behind the eyes, referring to Killer's ability to be able to kill without requiring a name, which is a fake that to Elle's existence. As if the two killers were to meet, then that would create an unfavorable situation for him, which makes him try to take action as fast as he could. And the candidates orchestrated the following situation. Elle accompanied Light to the university he studies at under his usual alias of Ryuzaki, disguising the details about the second killer. And in response to Light's question on how exactly will Elle counter the second killer, he puts on a Hyotoko mask. Ryuzaki joins them after this happens, and she introduces herself to Elle. She gets curious about the face behind the mask, so she excitedly takes it off, only to have a very noticeably different expression, but also noticing the fact that Misa looks over his head as if there was something she could see, right before she thinks back to the cheery popular girl face. Elle had given both Lai and Misa a false alias, meaning that it was likely that Misa had realized that the name she had been given was actually wrong, which would explain her surprise. Elle quickly covers it up by claiming to be a fan of hers, as she had done extensive research on her background prior to this, even claiming to be a fan of her recent opening to divert her attention. The rest of the scene plays off similar to the manga, where Elle gathers a large crowd, from which she steals Misa's phone and which ruins Light's plan of using Misa to kill Elle, as the task force quickly arrests Misa afterwards. Elle had already seen through the fact that Misa was the second killer far before this, as this was only to serve as a test for how Misa's powers actually work, because from Misa's fantastic behavior regarding killer, and prior to this, having cross-reference to clothing, perfume, and hair, and even fingerprints slightly the same as the ones found on second killer's tapes. Meaning is the point at which Lai and Misa had met, he was already completely sure of her identity. Elle had also already predicted that it was likely that both the killers had already met and were most likely working with each other now prior to this, by talking to Lai, testing to see if he would divulge any reaction. Misa's torture is similar to the original manga until in the middle of the fifth day, she loses her memory and starts acting completely normal, as if she had no memories of anything that led to this. Elle was able to infer that it was a genuine emotion rather than an act Misa had been pulling. Rather than an act Misa had been pulling. Elle believed that Killer Prime had most likely induced some sort of amnesia related to her memories about the methods through which Killer kills and still possess her memories and love for life. Seeing through his intention of using this to prevent the investigation of finding any information out of her through any means they might try to use. Lai gets himself thrown into custody to prove whether or not the killing stopped without their presence to do anything. Things go like normal until the seventh day, where Lai freaks out and words of actual honesty begin to come out of his mouth, similar to Misa. The week after this, the connected killing begins once again, which on paper will prove that there's no possibility for both use the Shinigami as his trick, it still seems to be unprepared, as he, on command, fabricated his own death after realizing that God had killed Watani with the Shinigami, even going so far as to earlier put on heart rate monitors to ensure that life with Asia could view L's own heartbeat going down. It's unknown whether L actually stopped his heartbeat in the scene, or whether the information presented on screen was just fabricated. I'll leave that for you to interpret in the comment section below. Seeing that both of them are downstairs, walks over to the HQ to meet up with propaganda can be difficult to talk about because there's not neat universal agreement on what exactly the word means. If we take a very wide definition, then propaganda just becomes any speech that tries to convince you of anything, and that will make almost anyone a propagandist when they deign to open their mouth. We could also define propaganda so narrowly that it only applies to the most egregious examples of political manipulation out there. And for our purposes, we want something in the middle. In his book, Stanley propaganda of some kind is almost certainly just unavoidable because humans aren't disembodied rational spirits that many of us have historically wished that we were. We are messy, emotional animals, and I don't think it's even totally possible to draw a neat line between where our rationality stops and our emotionality begins. So the pertinent question isn't whether we can get rid of propaganda entirely, since we almost certainly can't. Instead, we just want to understand how it works so that we can make reasoned judgments about what it is and how we might go about managing it. For instance, in his speech, Old Major references the many cruelties enacted on the animals by Farmer Jones. Many of us would support this kind of propaganda, partly because it's in service to an ideal that we happen to value already, which is freedom, but also because it largely makes true statements that are representative of reality, simply in an emotionally charged way, rather than making things up wholesale or selectively using facts to mislead the assembled crew. That doesn't mean that it's not propaganda, it just means that it is propaganda of a particular kind. Importantly, there's no neat way to divide propaganda into good and bad camps, because that would involve just solving the issue of what good and bad are in a kind of real sense. And if you've done that, then that's fantastic. You should definitely submit that paper and solve a huge part of philosophy. But clearly, at least in a kind of everyday sense, we do make judgments about whether certain kinds of rhetoric or propaganda and certain uses we put those to are acceptable, even if they're not what we would consider in an ideal world. And we also deem some uses of propaganda as more unacceptable than others. I think that much of this will have to do with the extent that the propaganda is leading us away from truth, and the extent to which it supports the same set of ideals that we happen to already. And so we consider the normative implications it's making true as well. These observations are also very much relevant outside of the political sphere. Stanley points out that an awful lot of commercial advertising can be considered a kind of supportive propaganda. Adverts will often present an ideal of what they think their product can do for a customer, and appeal to our attachment to that ideal in order to convince us to buy it. This shares many of the same structural similarities with propaganda, and I imagine that again, whether we consider it acceptable will probably be to do with whether the product is likely to actually bring us further in line with the proposed idea. And something that I want to get across here is that the internet hasn't in any sense created these propagandistic tendencies. In fact, I'm not necessarily convinced that it has directly made them worse. It is just that since it functions as the common place in which our discourse occurs, we're likely to see a lot of propaganda manifest online, and we'll come to the particular mechanisms through which this functions later in the video. But next, I want to look at one of the key ways by which propaganda operates, and ask the question, how is it that it can be so very effective? If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing either to the channel, or if you're feeling incredibly generous and want to gain access to exclusive content, including my slow motion book-by-book bookshelf tour, then consider subscribing to the Patreon, though it's absolutely no pressure. The links are in the description. 2. Epistemology and ideology. Expertise is a great thing. When I fall ill, it is absolutely wonderful that there is this group of people called medical doctors who can look at me and tell me what's wrong and give me some magic thing to make me better and then send me on my merry way. I'm very glad that we have experts in things like chemistry and engineering and history and physics and maths, so that we know where we can go to for relatively reliable information on these topic areas. However, there is a potentially more pernicious use of expertise, and that use is to deliberately lock some viewpoints or some people out of discourse, kind of semi-permanently, and not for respectable epistemic reasons, but rather for reasons of political or practical power. Something that Stanley talks about in his book is that expertise can be abused in order to
Oh, so much paper, print stuff. It's very heavy. Not bad. I don't know what to say at this point.
ideology is one that prevents us from gaining knowledge about the world in a major way. In this case, it prevents the other animals from gaining the knowledge that they are being treated unfairly. In 1984, it prevents the citizens from gaining even the most basic knowledge about their world, because one of the core tenets of the monopolistic ideology there is extreme epistemic trust in the party and Big Brother. In effect, this kind of propaganda uses expertise as a smokescreen in service to you downloaded this crazy medieval healing game. You absolutely know it. Yeah, right. Every simulation made my play forces me to first second ass. They've seen all those trash games. Lasted my last two ads. Everything depends on you. Come try it. An unjustified appeal to ideology. To bring this back to the internet, we can think of an example that I've talked about on the channel before, which is the proliferation of therapy speak. Here, the expertise that we associate with therapists is often leveraged, completely unjustifiably, to make vast sweeping claims about relationships and morality, where the evidence for such claims is either insufficient or simply irrelevant. I've even seen some people refer to themselves online with titles like narcissism experts, whatever that means, and then make a series of kind of vague ethical claims about groups of people being fundamentally evil. But this isn't just found in the relationship side of the internet. One of the reasons why I spend so much time on the channel clarifying that I'm not an expert about the things I discuss, and am instead just another person trying to learn more about them, is because it is so commonplace online for people to assume that bells and whistles of expertise and then employ that in a propagandistic way. If what we want from our discourse is to learn to think deeply and critically, this just isn't a very good setup. Additionally, much of how we tend to this is in no way an easy problem to solve. That being said, this is quite an abstract propaganda technique. There are also more straightforward methods of fooling people, and many of these have to do with the language. 3. The influence of language. George Orwell, at least as far as I've read him, seems absolutely fascinated by language. He was a writer of language the world was getting. In 1904, we famously have the dreaded concept of newspeak, which would deprive people of the concepts they would need to recognize their situation under Big Brother as unfair and rebel against the state. And in Animal Farm, similar methods are employed to keep subservient animals. Animals in line. But what language techniques do propagandists tend to use, and why do they appear to work so very well? Here is a really famous question in the history of philosophy. It's not to do with ontology, it's to do with domestic relations. It's actually the question, when did you stop beating your wife? But that's a bit morbid for my taste, so I prefer a very similarly structured question that emerged in the 2000s at UK playground team, does your mum know you're gay? Which was said to me many times. Maybe it was that. So, what is it about this question that makes it a good tease? Well, teenage boys are a bit immature, and thus they tend to find the prospect of being homosexual or seen as homosexual as hugely embarrassing. And so their instinct is to say, no, but of course, while it's true, trivially so, that your mum doesn't know that you're gay if you're not in fact gay, provided of course the truth is a precondition for knowledge. The denial doesn't come across like that. The denial seems like it's just denying that your mum knows you are gay, rather than asserting that you are in fact not gay. Logicians of yesteryear used to call these statements exponable. We could just call them loaded or containing presuppositions. This is a pretty explicit example of a loaded statement, but I wanted to start with it because it gets us into the habit of thinking that statements and sentences and words communicate much more than they explicitly state, and that sometimes they do have presuppositions baked into them from the start. Simone Weil discusses this in quite a lot of depth in her essay on the power of words, which she wrote after returning from the Spanish Civil War, quite disillusioned with the way that combatants there used abstract ideals to justify atrocities and cruelty. She talks about how countries involved the very name of their country into a word loaded with as many positive presuppositions and associations as possible. So, France might become inexorably tied up with ideals like freedom and equality and fraternity. In itself, this is neither good
Oh my face, I'm tired, bruh. Holy moly. No, what time is it? Oh, it's almost 2. 2 a.m. Still up. I think I'm crazy, bro. I think I'm going crazy.
Visit the Christmas markets and share every festive moment with loved ones around the world. Bring in the new year by staying connected, no matter where the night takes you. For those traveling year-round, this is a great time. And when it comes to staying in Europe, we've got you covered. Save memories, not long queues for the SIM card at the airport. Enjoy the most wonderful time of the year with hassle-free connectivity.
Yeah. I'm sorry, your day trip to where? Oh, so this is a summer camp where you see a concentration camp, and then your next activity is making jam. That program's called Birthright Onward, which is for birthright kids that couldn't quite get over their cool summer in Israel. And this is exactly what we've been saying Birthright is. It is an indoctrination trip. Not only does it indoctrinate you into political Zionism and the ethno-supremacist ideology that is, but it also normalizes the inherent violence in that. Think about what it means to visit a concentration camp and not to be concerned about the people within the concentration camp, but to commiserate about the people in that concentration camp fighting for their way out. That is disgusting. This is exactly what I mean by you don't have to go searching for Zionists bragging about their crimes. You don't need to invade their spaces. You don't need to go pretend to be Jewish on Birthright. You just need to watch what they say. This person is not admitting. They are bragging about their complicity with these war crimes. And as reprehensible and disgusting as that is to the rest of us who see the genocide going on, I do want to consider, as Americans, how much we do this. How much do you take a school trip to a military base? Military bases, by the way, which have enabled genocide, that enabled this genocide. How normalized is it for you to visit prison where there is slave labor going on? How normalized is it for there to be ICE concentration camps? They are not of the same scale, and that is significant, but violence and state violence and ethnic oppression is built into the fabric of the United States, and it is shocking when we see it in Israel, and it should be, but I would like you to be just as shocked when you see it in the United States. But this is our Gaza onward teacher. Lewis Hamilton won with Ferrari. Arsenal won the Premier League. USA!
Jalen runs his legs off. What do you mean by that? He's my engine. Jimmy Fallon is the best talk show host that Jimmy Kimmel.
Okay, well, so we have a couple lines. We got to be allowed. I think at the time it was allowed to relax the F word 3 times. And I said, okay, well,
How many are we off by? And they said, Fred.
and yeah, he got so sick of the question.
He finally said, I'm going to marry Ashley. George.
What is this? I'm not touching you. Yeah, I didn't know that I was a bad. So I had dinner with Tom Cruise like years ago after he did that thing out at the building. I kind of cornered him and I said, "Hey, tell me about this. Like, I'm afraid I could you do this thing. It's just laser locked." And he was like, because he really wanted to talk about it. He said, "I've been dreaming of the shot for 15 years of this sequence, and finally I had a chance to do it." Like, well, so how did it come to pass? And he goes, okay. So I go to the safety guy and tell him this is what I'm gonna do. This is what I'm gonna explain the whole gag. Right? The safety guy says, "You can't do that. That's too dangerous."
And I'm like, And he goes, so I get another safety guy.
Sir, pwede po ba mag-reroute? Gusto ko na po kasing graduate. Delayed na po kasi ako. no matter a grade of A through F, how would you? The crucial card, Mr. D. call it. I think everybody should be able to. So what now? In some quest controls, there's no.
Sometimes,
Some crazy.
legalization.
Someone say, Mama, Mama.
Getting ready.
Using loaded or presuppositional language is often employed by the pigs in order to permit themselves actions that other animals would otherwise deem unacceptable. We've already seen this in how the figure of Farmer Jones becomes a loaded term, synonymous with villainy and tyranny and everything the animals detest, and how this allows Napoleon to make ever-increasing encroaches on the liberty of the other animals, making them work hard. Forward lending, fast cash flow. Nobody likes Bill Gates anymore. Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates is now expressing regret for his association with Jeffrey Epstein. In fact, honestly, thinking Bill Gates is outright evil is kind of the norm now. Embattled Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates has undergone a stunning fall from grace. But if you're like me, you probably remember a time not that long ago where Bill Gates wasn't hated, but was actually one of the most loved people in the world. Bill and Melinda Gates continue to inspire us with their impatient optimism that together we can remake the world as it should be. I mean that literally. There's a global survey from less than 10 years ago that ranked Bill Gates as the most admired man on Earth.
You're making such a huge difference, so I'm glad you're a believer.
But my point here is that for 25 years before he was a cute, cuddly billionaire spending his fortune to save sick babies, Bill Gates was the most hated businessman in America. And I happen to have a special guest with me today. Throughout his career as the inventor of the computer as we know it today, he was accused of lying, cheating, stealing, sabotaging competitors, bullying employees, destroying entire companies. He is indefatigable, and he's absolutely focused, and he wants it all. He's young, and he's mean, and he's not tired. And building Microsoft into such a dominant force that the United States Department of Justice had to step in to stop him from destroying the same industry he had created. The real question is, how much more could have been achieved without the dead hand of monopoly?
How many of you use a PC without Microsoft's operating system? Gentlemen, that's a monopoly. That's a lock. That's 100%.
So just to give you guys a fair warning, this probably isn't going to be the type of video where we talk about how Bill Gates controls the weather and put microchips in our COVID vaccines, but we are going to look at how he actually controls the world anyway. Because Bill Gates really did help save millions of lives, and he really did help create the world of computers as we know it. He is one of the most consequential people in the world. It's just that while he was doing that, he created a level of control and influence over our civilization that no other person in modern history could match. Eventually, he became the perfect symbol of the billionaire age itself, the structure of power under which all of us are living today. Or as I like to call it, the age where the people who created our problems are Microsoft to sell us the solution. This is the story of Bill Gates. Police and security guards in Belgium caught flat-footed today by a cowardly sneak attack on one of the world's wealthiest men. The target was Microsoft Chairman Bill Gates, arriving for a meeting with community leaders. Watch what happens when a team of medium persons with high in the face. Gates was momentarily and understandably shaken, but he was not injured. His squad piled on with two more flies. Let's wind back the clock just a little bit and see how this got here. It's 1982, a time before social media, before online video, before the internet, before average people like you and I used computers at all. A time when the technology that defines our world today was nothing but a dream of the future.
We already know that the 1970s will bring the superjet age of technology, and we are fast approaching the ideal information handling system we dreamed of many years ago. We in the IBM company face the same challenge as you do.
Right now, almost but not quite 200 people work at Microsoft. As a relatively early-stage small startup, they work out of a bland, beige, two-story office building in Seattle. Or really, not Seattle, but Seattle's more suburban little sister, Bellevue. Their office sits between a preschool, La Quinta Inn, and a restaurant called Burger Master, and their CEO is 26 years old. His name is William Henry Gates III, but everyone calls him Bill. He's a Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of a nerd with huge glasses that cover half his face, and he wears bizarrely ugly sweaters every day. He drives a green Porsche 911, and he crashes it all of the time. When his employees bring him an idea that he doesn't like, he has a habit of responding with, "That's the stupidest fucking thing I've ever seen." Okay, a bit clean in here. What's going on, guys? I guess I probably don't do this angle all that often, but I've got my books, got my Bill Gates fan fiction. Let's dive into it. On paper, 27-year-old Bill Gates is already a multi-millionaire, but people around him describe that he still works 100 hours every week, no matter what. Right now, though, Microsoft's flagship product is called MS-DOS, and it's a 16-bit, single-user, single-tasking, command-line-driven, disk-based operating system written in 8086 assembly language. Whatever that means. The American public is generally unaware of who Bill Gates is, let alone his company. On the rare occasions the press has covered him, they treat Microsoft as a curiosity, a small startup run by a nerdy-looking Harvard dropout from Seattle. Even back then, though, Bill Gates makes his vision very clear.
A lot of people are forecasting that there'll be software stores just like their record stores today, and that there'll be thousands and thousands of those. And I think I'd have to agree with that.
And during an interview he does for the first ever edition of PC Magazine, his prediction for the next 5 years of computers is bold, bordering between unlikely and pure fantasy. He says, "We'll be able to put on somebody's desk for an incredibly low-cost processor with more capability than you could ever use. In other words, we will have changed the way people work. The office of the future will be the office of the present 5 years from today."
Eventually what will happen is that everyone will have a personal computer on their desk. We really believe that a personal computer will be valuable for everyone. We also believe that eventually it'll be worthwhile to have one in the home, but that's going to take a lot longer to make come true.
He believes that computers are the future, and he illustrates this with this one mantra that he says over and over and over: a computer on every desk and in every home.
Well, I think we will get one in every office, in every home. Exciting vision of a machine on every desktop. I have no doubt that that vision of a computer in every home, that'll absolutely be achieved.
And we know today that that dream kind of did come true. When I look around at all the computers on my desk, I have my monitor, which is technically a computer. I have my Mac desktop. I have my iPhone. This is a computer. I have my camera. This is also a computer. I'm filming on a camera right now. I have AirPods, which is a computer.
This is a different paradigm. Everything's a computer. That's beautiful. Wow.
You get my point. But at the time, no one else agrees with him at all. Ken Olsen, who's the founder of one of the biggest computer companies in the 1960s, whose computers cost $25,000 and weighed more than a refrigerator, famously said, "There is no reason for any individual to have a computer in his home." And that was basically the prevailing sentiment at the time. But Bill Gates and his team are going to do whatever it will take to make his vision of the future
come out with is far too little and far too late. Sometimes vaporware never comes out at all. Tesla announced the Roadster 2 in 2017, a bleeding-edge electric sports car that would be faster and cooler than anything ever made. But 9 years later, it still doesn't exist. Theranos was a startup that was founded on the promise of devices that could run hundreds of medical tests from one drop of blood. They raised almost $1 billion from investors, although it was eventually revealed that the underlying concept was actually medically impossible, and its youngest self-made woman billionaire founder was sent to prison for fraud, where she remains to this day. My point is that vaporware describes everything our society has come to hate about modern tech and modern capitalism: unfinished or dishonest products, marketing without substance, and the general enshittification of everything we consume. But I'm not saying that they were the first ones to do vaporware and someone else made the word to describe them. They literally invented the word vaporware inside the company to describe how they were going to control and dominate the tech industry in the early 80s. At the end of 1983, Microsoft held a massive announcement at the Grand Historic Plaza Hotel in New York City, unveiling their brand new graphical operating system Windows with flash and pizzazz, and a promise that this groundbreaking software would release in just 6 months.
The retail package of Microsoft Windows. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Here.
However, they weren't the first to the punch. VisiCorp, a company from Boston, already had an operating system for sale in 1982, and it was one of the first modern operating systems as we know it, with a mouse for controlling the interface and multitasking apps, blah, blah, blah. You get what I mean. It was more powerful and modern than anything that Microsoft had done yet, and with VisiCorp's yearly revenue being 15 times higher than Microsoft at the time, their success was apparent. When Windows was announced, though, with so many promises and such bombastic fanfare, enough PC manufacturers signed on to include Windows on their new machines that VisiCorp sales declined massively. Meanwhile, when the spring of 1983 rolls around, Windows 1.0 is nowhere to be found. It won't actually be released for another 20 months, or more than 2 years after it was first announced. At this point, magazine editors started saying stuff like, buyers believe in Microsoft release dates with the same fervor that they believe in Santa Claus. In the end, by the time Windows was actually released, VisiCorp had gone completely bankrupt. They weren't the only one either. The Windows release debacle killed a whole category of companies. GEM, DeskView, Software Arts, these were all pretty big software companies back in the day, and they were all destroyed by the announcement of Windows looking bigger and better than anything they had made. In reality, though, Microsoft had strangled their competitors to death with software that didn't even exist, and I mean that literally. During all the time when Windows was not out yet, when the rest of the industry stopped buying other programs in anticipation of what Microsoft might make, it turned out that Windows did not really exist. What they had announced, in reality, was a couple of screenshots that they had not even yet started making work.
A calendar program that uses the graphical interface. We got a card file. We got a terminal program.
But at least Microsoft Windows 1.0 was groundbreaking, right? Well, not really. Windows 1.0 actually got terrible reviews. Journalists called it clunky, magazines wrote that the entire thing was running off floppy disks that felt like pouring molasses in the Arctic, and one magazine scored it a 4 out of 10. And ultimately, while their pre-orders were high with all the marketing they had done, Windows ended up selling less than 500,000 copies in the first 2 years. Even in the early days of personal computers, that was a flop. But for all their failures, dishonesty, and lies, they were only rewarded with a bigger, better profile than ever before and a list of competitors who had literally gone out of business in the meantime. They had won the race, even though they were cheating. In all of this, the lies, the strangulation, it was only the beginning. For the next 20 years, Bill Gates and Microsoft would change the world by building the most powerful and the most hated company in the history of American business. It's 1985. Microsoft has grown to almost, but not quite, 1,000 employees. They outgrew their bland beige 2-story suburban office building. And by that, I mean they expanded to occupy 4 more, all still on the same street between Burgermaster and La Quinta, and a strangely high number of dental clinics. Bill Gates is now 29 years old. He still wears odd sweaters and huge glasses and kind of looks like a kid. The media still seems to not entirely know what to make of him. In one profile from Fortune magazine, he's called the Rabid Rabbit, a gawky, bookish nerd who is intensely competitive and aloof and sarcastic. One interview described his fashion sense at work as pizza-stained t-shirts that make clients mistake him for the office boy. All the same, though, he's now worth around $100 million.
We're expecting to do just over $100 million this year.
Although when CNBC
runs his first major TV interview, he proudly declares that he isn't in it for the money.
I don't think anyone at the company is in it for the money. Creation of these programs is something you can sit down and see people enjoying and solving real problems.
If you would say
I'm a call it. I'm a stop. Thank you very much. How do I end this? Holy. Let's end that. Okay, bye bye, guys.